When my wife laughed at me in front of her CEO and called me just another child to take care of instead of a husband, I sat there with a smile that felt like glass cutting my skin. The restaurant was bright, the wine glasses tall, and the sound of her voice louder than every fork scraping the plates. Caleb Rowe, her boss, leaned back in his chair with that smug grin, looking at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience she had to drag along. Marissa's laugh wasn't the one I knew from years ago. It was sharp, rehearsed, meant to impress. She gestured toward me with her manicured hand and added, "Sometimes it feels like I have 2 kids at home instead of 1. Caleb chuckled, tapping his glass against hers, and for a moment I wished the floor would open and swallow me whole. I didn't answer. My jaw tightened, my chest burned, but I forced my lips into a polite smile. Inside, though, the words cut deeper than she could ever imagine. A man can take silence, he can take being overlooked, but mockery, that's different. That night wasn't just a dinner. It was a line drawn in the sand. While she savored her moment, I swallowed mine. But deep inside, I promised myself that one day she would look at me not with mockery, but with regret. And that day would come sooner than she ever thought. Ethan lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the words Marissa had thrown at him echoing again and again. There was a time when she looked at his sketches with wide eyes, telling him that his ideas were brilliant, that one day he would see his work in magazines and showrooms. She used to sit beside him on the couch, asking questions about why he chose a certain curve for a chair leg or why he mixed steel with oak. Back then, she said he had a gift, but those days felt like they belonged to another marriage, a different version of her. Somewhere along the climb up her company ladder, she started looking down on him. It wasn't just at that dinner. The small cracks had been forming for months, maybe even years. Every time she got a promotion, every time she bought a new suit, every time her paychecks grew heavier than his, her voice grew sharper with. She made jokes about his work hours, calling them hobby hours. If he spent a late night hunched over a drafting table, she would roll her eyes and mutter that she was glad someone in the house had a real job. Ethan wasn't blind to her change. He felt it in how she stopped asking about his day. He noticed when she started comparing him to her colleagues' husbands, the ones with big salaries, the ones who wore expensive watches. She reminded him, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in open jabs, that he wasn't on their level. And the more she compared, the smaller he felt standing next to her. Still, he loved designing. Furniture was not just a pastime for him, it was where his imagination lived. Every line of wood, every curve of metal was a piece of him. But Marissa treated his creations like childish doodles. She would glance at a finished sketch and shrug, then change the subject to her office politics or her latest meeting with Caleb. What once had been encouragement had hardened into dismissal. That night at the dinner, when she made that cruel joke, it was Caleb's reaction that sealed it in Ethan's memory. The man didn't just laugh, he smirked, leaning back like Marissa had handed him a secret weapon. Caleb had always looked at Ethan like he was an afterthought, but now it was worse. Now he had permission to see him as less than her. Ethan kept his face calm, kept his hands steady on the table, but inside he was boiling. He didn't lash out, didn't make a scene, didn't give her the satisfaction of showing how much it hurt. Instead, he let the sting settle into his bone. He sat quietly while they carried on with their laughter, while the conversation turned back to business, while Marissa basked in the glow of her boss's approval. But deep down, Ethan made a decision. He didn't need to tell her, and he didn't need to tell Caleb. His silence was not weakness. It was the start of something they couldn't see yet. That humiliation wouldn't fade, and it wouldn't be forgiven. He would carry it until the day came when he could lay it down in front of her, not as anger, but as proof that she had underestimated him for the last time. The ride home was quiet, but it wasn't a comfortable silence. Ethan kept his eyes on the road while Marissa scrolled through her phone, the screen's glow flashing across her face. He could still hear her laugh from the dinner, sharp and echoing, and it made his hands grip the wheel tighter. When they finally pulled into the driveway, he sat for a moment, waiting for her to say something, but she only sighed, unbuckled her seatbelt, and headed inside without looking back. Ethan followed her in, closing the door softly behind him. She was already slipping off her heels, tossing them by the wall like she couldn't be bothered. He stood in the doorway of the living room, his voice steady but edged with hurt. "Why would you say that about me tonight? In front of your boss?" Marissa didn't look up from her earrings she was unclipping. "Don't start with me, Ethan. You know how important those dinners are. Don't make me look bad in front of important people." He blinked, stunned. "Make you look bad? You called me a child. You humiliated me." She set her earrings down with a small clink and finally met his eyes, her expression flat. "You should be grateful I even take you to these events. Do you think Caleb cares about your little designs? These dinners are about business, about building a future. Don't drag me down by being sensitive." Her words landed heavier than anything she'd said before. Ethan felt something inside him shift, like a thread snapping. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way she said it, like he was an accessory she had to tolerate, not a partner she respected. He stood there, waiting for her to soften, but she only turned away, pulling her hair back into a clip as if the conversation was over. He wanted to argue, to remind her of the nights she used to sit beside him and cheer him on, but he saw no trace of that woman now. All he saw was someone who saw him as a weight she carried rather than a man she chose. His throat tightened, but he swallowed the words, letting the silence settle between them. Later that night, when the house was dark and Marissa had gone to bed, Ethan stayed awake. He sat at his drafting table in the corner of his small home office, a lamp casting a warm circle of light across his paper. His pencil moved over the page, slow at first, then faster as lines began to take shape. The anger didn't spill out in shouts or slammed doors. It poured into curves of wood, into the clean edges of tables and chairs that existed only in his mind until they touched the paper. The hours slipped by, but he didn't notice. He didn't want sleep, not with her words still fresh in his head. He sketched until his wrist ached, until the sun began to touch the curtain. Each design felt like a step away from her shadow, a step closer to something that belonged only to him. Ethan didn't tell her what he was planning. He didn't need to. The more she dismissed him, the clearer it became. She no longer saw him as her equal, but he would find a way to show her. Not through arguments, not through desperate words. He would let his work speak, and when it did, she would understand what she had thrown away. It started on an ordinary afternoon. Ethan was at a small community expo, the kind of event where local creators showed off their work. He had brought a few sketches and models, not expecting much. He didn't even stay at the table most of the time, just watched from a distance while people passed by without stopping. Toward the end of the day, a woman paused in front of his display. She leaned down to study one of the wooden chair models, her brow furrowed, not with confusion, but with focus. When Ethan stepped closer, she looked up and smiled. "Did you make these?" Her name was Laura Jennings. She was an architect, mid-30s, approachable, with a calm confidence that didn't need to prove itself. Ethan nodded and explained a little about his ideas, embarrassed by how simple his setup looked compared to others. But Laura wasn't polite for the sake of it. She asked questions, detailed ones, about the balance of weight, the structure of joints, the kind of wood he would use. She wasn't just being nice. She was genuinely impressed. After a long conversation, she said, I work with a design firm that's been looking for fresh perspective. You should meet them. They need people who think like this." Ethan almost laughed it off, but the seriousness in her voice made him pause. She gave him her card, told him to call, and walked away, leaving him holding a chance he hadn't expected. A week later, after a quiet debate with himself, he did call. Laura introduced him to a mid-sized firm downtown. The office wasn't glamorous, but the energy there was different. People were tired of recycled ideas, desperate for something original. When they flipped through his sketches, the room grew quiet, and Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: respect. They weren't humoring him. They saw potential. The offer wasn't huge, not at first. It was a short-term contract, a chance to prove himself. But to Ethan, it felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. He signed without hesitation, keeping it private. Marissa didn't need to know. He wanted this to be his, untouched by her scorn or dismissal. The work started slowly. Deadlines came quickly, and the firm wanted results fast. There were nights Ethan stared at a blank page, his pencil frozen in his hand, the pressure heavy on his shoulder. Doubt crept in, whispering that Marissa might be right, that he was just a dreamer. But Laura was there. She stopped by his desk, not with pity, but with encouragement. "Don't chase perfect lines," she told him one evening as he erased a sketch for the 5th time. "Just put down what feels right. Your instincts are better than you think." Her words mattered more than she realized. She didn't mock him, didn't measure his worth in paychecks or promotions. She treated him like a peer, someone whose work had value. Slowly, Ethan began to believe it again. Late nights at the drafting table didn't feel lonely anymore. He wasn't drawing just to escape. He was building something real. Every new design became a quiet promise to himself. This was the start of something he wouldn't let Marissa take away. Marissa's voice filled the kitchen one morning as she scrolled through her phone, reading an email from her office. She tossed her hair back and said, "Caleb just told me I'll be leading the next client pitch. That's what happens when you put in real work." She didn't even glance at Ethan as she poured herself coffee, but her tone carried the usual sting. Every small success at her job became another excuse to remind him that she was moving forward while he was, in her eyes, standing still. At dinner with friends, she bragged about late nights at the office, about her boss trusting her with major accounts. When the conversation drifted toward Ethan, she would give a small shrug and say, "Oh, he's still doing his little project." The word little was always sharp, always deliberate. Ethan sat through it without flinching, but inside he could feel the walls between them thickening. She started coming home later, too. At first she explained it away. Meetings ran long, deadlines were close. But the excuses grew thinner as the nights grew later. Sometimes she didn't bother to explain at all. Her key would turn in the lock close to midnight, and she would head straight upstairs, too tired, she said, to talk. Ethan noticed her perfume lingered stronger on those nights, and her laugh carried a different edge when she spoke about Caleb the next morning. He didn't accuse her. He didn't demand answers. He watched, quiet, piecing together what her loyalty to Caleb might mean. He knew the man's reputation, charm mixed with arrogance, the kind of leader who enjoyed having power over people. Marissa admired him too much, trusted him too deeply, and Ethan wondered if that trust had already crossed into something. Even so, he stayed patient. He knew that storming in with suspicions would only give her more reasons to mock him. She already saw him as fragile, too sensitive. He refused to hand her more ammunition. Instead, he chose silence, not because he was weak, but because he was waiting. At night, when the house was empty of her voice, Ethan worked in his office. He poured everything into his sketches, every slight remark, every long evening alone. His hands moved with a steadiness that surprised him. Each design grew sharper, more alive, like his focus had finally sharpened into a weapon. Marissa barely noticed. She breezed in and out of the house, speaking about clients and contracts, her words carrying a weight meant to remind him she was important, and he was not. Ethan let her think that. He let her believe she had pulled so far ahead that he could never catch up. In truth, he was building something she couldn't see, something she couldn't belittle. And when the time came, she would understand that the man she dismissed as a child was far more than the role she had written for. Until then, he stayed quiet, his patience stronger than her arrogance. The first real breakthrough came when the firm asked Ethan to submit a set of designs for a new line of office furniture. It wasn't just about looks. The company wanted something modern, practical, and different from what was already filling offices across the country. Ethan stayed late in the office most nights, bent over his sketches while the others packed up and left. He felt something awaken in him that had been asleep for years. His pencil moved fast, his ideas sharper than before, as if every word Marissa had thrown at him had carved a path toward this moment. When he presented his first set of drafts to the team, the room grew still. People leaned in, tracing the lines on the paper, murmuring to each other. His designs weren't flashy for the sake of it. They were strong, functional, and fresh. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt proud without hesitation. The firm didn't just accept his work. They decided to feature it in their upcoming corporate bid, one of the biggest opportunities they had chased in years. It wasn't until later that Ethan discovered who they would be bidding against. Laura handed him the file with the client's name at the top, her eyes steady on his face. It was a nationwide chain looking for new office layouts, the kind of project that could transform a company. Among the competitors listed, Ethan's eyes froze on one name, Marissa's Corporation. His chest tightened, but not with fear. Instead, there was a quiet fire. This was it, the chance he hadn't known he was waiting for. The same company where his wife had mocked him, the same boss who had laughed at his expense. They were on the other side now. Ethan threw himself into the work. He barely noticed the days blending into nights, his desk covered with sketches, models, and notes. His pain turned into focus, his anger into lines of oak and steel. Each design carried a piece of what he had endured, but instead of bitterness, it came out as strength. He wasn't just making furniture. He was telling his story in wood and form. Laura often stopped by when the office grew quiet. She watched him work and reminded him to step back, to breathe, but she never told him to slow down. One evening, when Ethan admitted he wasn't sure if he could beat the giants they were competing against, Laura placed her hand on the table and said softly, "Sometimes betrayal is the push you need to show the world who you are. Let this be the proof." Her words settled in him like an anchor. He realized he wasn't just working to win a contract. He was working to reclaim the part of himself Marissa had tried to erase. Every sketch, every draft, every revision was a step toward that moment. He knew the bid wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel small. He felt ready. Marissa came home one evening with a bottle of wine, and a smile stretched wide across her face. She placed the bottle on the counter, dropped her purse onto the chair, and announced, "This is it, Ethan. The project I've been waiting for. If we land this, my career is set. Caleb says it's the biggest pitch we've ever had." She poured herself a glass before even taking off her jacket, her eyes glowing with pride. Ethan sat at the table, listening, his face calm. She went on, describing how the company was preparing presentations, how the client was a nationwide chain looking for a fresh new image. She called it her career-defining moment, her chance to prove herself once and for all. Ethan nodded at the right times, his hands folded, but inside he already knew. This was the same client he and Laura's firm were working day and night for. The irony wasn't lost on him. Marissa thought she was on the edge of her greatest triumph, and yet the designs she mocked as little projects were about to stand against her own. He wanted to tell her, to watch her face as she realized, but he stayed silent. He knew it wasn't time yet. Over the next few weeks, she filled the house with talk of the pitch. She practiced her lines in the mirror, rehearsed in the living room, and called Caleb at all hours to discuss details. Sometimes Ethan caught the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, how her laughter lingered longer than it should. He tucked that suspicion away, letting it sit beside the other wounds she had left him. At the dinner table, she continued her jabs. Ethan, maybe you should pay attention when I practice these presentations. You might learn a thing or two about professionalism. Other times she would smile thinly and say, one of us has to carry this household after all. Her words rolled off her tongue so casually, as if she didn't even realize how sharp they were. Or maybe she did. Ethan didn't rise to her bait. He let her believe he was still in the shadows, tinkering with sketches that led nowhere. The truth was too close to the surface now, but he held it back with patience. She thought she had everything under control, that Caleb valued her more than anyone, that her future was already written. At night, when she left her notes scattered across the table, Ethan sometimes paused to glance at them. He recognized the same client name that sat at the top of his own files at work. Each time he saw it, his resolve deepened. The storm was coming, and she had no idea. Marissa's confidence swelled with each passing day, while Ethan's silence grew heavier. The tension between them wasn't in shouting matches or arguments. It was in the way he no longer reacted to her, the way he simply watched. She mistook it for weakness, but it was preparation. She thought he was doing nothing. In reality, he was waiting for the moment when she would finally see who he really was. The morning of the presentation carried a weight Ethan hadn't felt in years. He dressed simply, nothing flashy, just a clean shirt and jacket, then made his way to the tall glass building where the meeting would take place. Laura greeted him with a steady smile. Just sit in the back, she whispered. Let me handle the room. You've already done your part. Ethan nodded, his heart steady but his hands restless. Inside, the conference room buzzed with voices, suits, and polished smiles. The client's team sat at a long table, flipping through notes, waiting for the pitches. Ethan slid into a chair at the back, unnoticed by most. From the corner of his eye, he saw Marissa walk in with Caleb. She was radiant with confidence, her head held high, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Caleb walked beside her, his usual smirk in place. They didn't see Ethan. Marissa set up her presentation first. She spoke with the same rehearsed authority she had practiced at home, her voice smooth, her gestures sharp. Caleb chimed in at the right moments, praising their company's history and vision. The client listened politely, nodding here and there, but their expressions stayed reserved. Ethan kept his eyes low, letting her have her moment, knowing what was coming. When it was time for Laura's firm, she stepped forward with calm composure. She introduced the designs as a new approach to workspace. Practical, modern, built for comfort and collaboration. One by one, she revealed Ethan's creations. The sleek chairs, the modular desks, the balanced blend of wood and steel filled the screen, each piece carrying his silent story. The room shifted. The clients leaned forward, their pens paused. Murmurs of interest spread around the table. One executive tapped the page of the design booklet, whispering to another. Ethan watched quietly as their faces lit with the same recognition Laura had shown the first time she saw his work. When the last slide faded, the head of the client team leaned back in his chair and said, "This is exactly what we've been searching for. Innovative, functional, and original. These designs stand out." He looked directly at Laura. "We're awarding the contract to your firm. Effective immediately, we'll be moving away from our current design division." Silence followed. Then Caleb stiffened in his chair, his jaw tight, his hand clenching the pen he held. Marissa's face drained of color. She glanced at the designs on the screen, then back at Laura, as if she couldn't make sense of what had just happened. The client went on, thanking Marissa and Caleb for their effort, but making it clear. The choice was final. Ethan sat still, his presence unnoticed, but his chest carried a calm victory. Caleb muttered something under his breath, slamming his notes shut, while Marissa stared at the screen like it had betrayed her. For years, she had mocked Ethan's work, dismissed his passion, but now his designs had erased the very foundation of her success. Ethan didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply rose from his chair at the back as the meeting ended, his steps quiet but steady. For the first time in a long time, he felt taller than the room around him. As the meeting wrapped up, people began gathering their notes, shaking hands, and murmuring about the decision. Ethan stayed in his seat at the back, waiting. Marissa was still frozen, her eyes locked on the designs projected on the screen, her lips slightly parted, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Caleb leaned in toward her, his voice sharp but not quiet enough to hide. How could you lose this? To them. To an amateur? His face was red, his composure cracked, and the executives nearby shifted uncomfortably at his outburst. Marissa flinched, trying to steady herself. It wasn't just me. Our whole team worked. But Caleb cut her off with a glare. You were supposed to deliver. Instead, you let this happen. Do you understand what this means for us? For me? His voice carried the kind of anger that left no room for defense. Ethan rose from his chair, smoothing his jacket, and for the first time Marissa's eyes met his across the room. The moment hung heavy between them. No words passed, but everything was there. Her mockery, his silence, the years of dismissal, and now the reversal she hadn't imagined possible. Ethan didn't smirk or frown. He simply held her gaze, steady and calm, letting the truth settle in her on its own. She opened her mouth as if to speak, maybe to call his name, maybe to excuse herself, but nothing came out. She looked small, smaller than he had ever seen her, stripped of the certainty she had worn like armor. Caleb didn't even notice their silent exchange. He was too busy gathering his papers, furious and muttering about lost revenue. Laura touched Ethan's arm gently, signaling it was time to leave. He picked up the folder that held the signed agreement, the contract that shifted the future into his hand. Without rushing, without glancing back again, he walked out beside her. His steps were light, not with arrogance, but with release, like a weight had finally lifted from his shoulders. Behind him, Marissa tried to regain her footing. She spoke quickly to Caleb, her words stumbling, desperate to explain that she hadn't failed alone. But her voice didn't carry the authority it once had. The humiliation wasn't just in losing the contract. It was in losing it to the man she had spent years belittling. The same man she had called a child had built the work that replaced her. In the hallway, away from the echo of voices, Ethan felt a calm settle deep inside. He hadn't shouted, hadn't sought revenge with loud triumph. The justice came in silence, in the simple act of walking out with the proof of his worth in his hand. Every insult she had thrown at him returned now, multiplied, without him having to say a single word. For years, Marissa had spoken over him, laughed at him, and dismissed him. Today, he had spoken back without opening his mouth. And that, Ethan realized, was the sweetest answer he could ever give. The weeks after the presentation moved quickly for Ethan. His designs became the centerpiece of the new project, and for the first time, he was treated with the respect he had always dreamed of. Meetings were no longer places where he felt invisible. People leaned toward him, asked questions, wanted his input. Laura often introduced him as the creative force behind the work, and he could see the recognition in their eyes. His career was no longer a shadow. It was something solid, something real. At home, the silence between him and Marissa grew heavier. She came back from work later than ever, but the edge of triumph was gone from her. Instead, she was quieter, distracted, her confidence cracked. The failure followed her into the office, where whispers began to spread. Colleagues who once respected her started to keep their distance, sensing Caleb's growing impatience. Caleb himself stopped calling her into meetings as often, his attention shifting elsewhere. The woman who once stood tall in front of everyone now found herself standing alone. Marissa tried, in small ways, to regain what she had lost. She mentioned new projects, hinted at opportunities, but Ethan could hear the doubt in her words. The arrogance she had carried so easily before had faded, leaving behind someone scrambling for footing. Ethan didn't argue with her. He didn't remind her of her words. He simply carried on with his own work, steady and quiet. His days became filled with creation, with sketches turning into prototypes and prototypes turning into finished pieces. Clients admired the blend of practicality and beauty in his designs, and more contracts began to arrive. He no longer needed validation from anyone. His work spoke clearly enough. Each step forward reminded him that the years of being overlooked had not been wasted. They had shaped him into someone who could withstand betrayal and turn it into strength. Late one night, as he sat in his office surrounded by drafts and models, Ethan allowed himself to think back. He remembered the sting of Marissa's laughter, the way it had cut through him in front of her boss, the way it had made him feel small. He realized now that betrayal doesn't always come in dramatic lies or loud arguments. Sometimes it comes in the simple, cruel laugh of someone who should protect you. But that laugh, sharp and humiliating as it was, had given him a fire he might never have found otherwise. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the sketches on the wall, and felt no bitterness. What once crushed him had set him free. He didn't need her approval anymore. He didn't need her recognition. He had built a world of his own, and it was enough. She called me a child in front of her world, Ethan thought, a quiet resolve in his chest. But in the end, it was her world that I replaced.